In the beginning, there was only God and darkness. Later, God decided to create day to separate the dark and the light. The second day, God created the skies and the seas. On the third day, he created land and vegetation. On the fourth, the sun, moon, and stars. The fifth, fish and birds dominate the skies and the seas. And the sixth day, all land creatures and humans. Humans were created in the image of God and in his likeness. They were to rule over God's creation and were to be fruitful and multiply all the earth. The first man was named Adam. Adam was to work the garden and was free to everything, all but one thing, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He was told by God not to eat the fruit that is from that tree, and he obeyed him for a little while. In time, God saw that Adam became lonely, so he created Eve, who Adam named a woman since she was made from his bones. The two worked in the garden together, multiplied the earth, all was perfect, and they lived happily ever after. That's what the plan was, at least. One day, as Eve was walking through the garden, a serpent came up to her and said to her, "Hey, you know if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God, knowing right from wrong, and your eyes will be open." Of course, the serpent didn't explain what really would happen, so Eve takes a bite and gives it to Adam. God knows what they did, and he punishes them with some grace involved. God kicks the two out of the garden on the east entrance. Now sin and death had entered the world. Adam was cursed to work from the ground his entire life, while Eve was to have pain in childbirth. However, God promised that a wounded victor would come from the line of Adam and will crush the serpent in time. The first boys were finally born, the older Cain and the younger Abel. Cain worked in the fields as a farmer and Abel was a shepherd. It looked like things were going the right way. Then humans had to screw it up again. Cain and Abel both offered offerings to God, but God favored Abel's more because his was his best and Cain's was just his leftovers. As a result, Cain killed his brother Abel and Cain was cursed by God. Now things looked bad again. The line was cut off. How is the promised warrior meant to come then? That is where Seth comes in. Fortunately, Adam and Eve had another son, and hope for humanity continues through Seth. In time, sin increases along with population. The world has become completely corrupt, and God wants to begin with a fresh slate. There was only one faithful man in the world. That man was Noah, from the line of Seth. God told him to build an ark and take two of each animal, male and female, onto the ark, along with his wife, sons, and daughter-in-laws. Noah obeys God and builds the ark. In time, water burst through the ground and rain came down from the skies. Water was everywhere, and the old man was even snoring. After 40 days and nights of rain, the water went down, and God made an unconditional covenant with Noah that he would never use a flood to destroy the earth again. So, once again, Noah was commanded to be fruitful and multiply the earth. Years down the road, humans forgot where they came from, so they wanted to make a name for themselves, not knowing they already had one. They even began to build a tower to the heavens. God did not like this at all and wanted to stop it, so he scattered them through language. Hope once again seemed lost. But one son of Noah, Shem, continued the line, and on to Abraham it went. Abram was a very faithful man to God and was favored by him. God called to Abram one night, promising descendants as numerous as the stars, a promised land, his presence, a blessed nation, and kings were meant to come from his line, the line of Judah. Not only kings on earth, but a king who would rule the entire world forever. This all seemed great to Abram. Oh, wait a minute, hold on. No, now it's Abraham, since his name was also changed during that promise. There was just one problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah were becoming, old. It didn't seem possible to the two of them. So Abraham did some stuff with Hagar and had a son, Ishmael, who they thought would carry on the line. But God said no, Isaac would, and Sarah was meant to give birth to him. In time, Isaac was born, and the line would now continue through their younger son, Isaac. The life of Abraham did call for much faith. He did many things a father and son would do. Teach him how to cook, use a bow and arrow, circumcise him as well, take him to the top of a mountain, tie him up, and almost sacrifice him. All the usual things a father and son would do. Later, God confirmed that he would fulfill this promise with Abraham by making a covenant with him. Circumcision was a covenant sign back then. It was now time for Isaac to begin his adulthood. He went out and married a woman named Rebekah. The two of them had Esau and Jacob. Esau was more the outdoor type, while Jacob was more the indoor and cook. Isaac favored Esau more, while Rebekah favored Jacob. One day, Isaac wanted his son Esau to bring him some soup. Isaac was blind, by the way, so Esau went out. Rebekah heard of this and decided to make a plan. Jacob was to disguise himself as his brother and serve the soup, so he gets the birthright. That is exactly what happened. Esau came back from hunting and begged for soup from his brother, but he needed to give his birthright to him, so he did, and Jacob went and stole the birthright. Esau found out and wanted to kill him. So Jacob fled to his uncle, where he saw the woman of his dreams, Rachel. In order to marry her, he agreed to work 7 years for his uncle. When the 7 years passed, Jacob married Rachel, and all was good, until the next morning when he saw it was her older and uglier sister, Leah. So he worked another 7 years and got Rachel. In total, Jacob had 11 sons, and the 12th one being Joseph, one that seemed to be a miracle child. He gave him a coat of many colors, which made his brothers jealous. His father and mother both loved him more, which made the brothers even more jealous. One night, Joseph had a dream where he was high above all his fellow brothers, and they were all bowing down to him. He had a second dream where the sun, moon, and stars also bowed down to him. These dreams also made his brothers jealous and now mad. His brothers wanted to kill him. That's how much they hated him. So they came with a plot. They decided to throw him into a pit, but it got even better for them. They sold him into slavery, and they lied about his death to his parents. Joseph was sold into slavery and was bought by an Egyptian man named Potiphar. He was favored by Potiphar much and worked in his household, until Potiphar's wife lied about what Joseph did, which caused him to end up in a prison cell. In the prison, Joseph met a baker and a cupbearer, and was able to explain the meaning behind both of their dreams, and both of them were accurate to what Joseph said them to be. Finally, Joseph was released from prison to tell what the dream of the Pharaoh was, since the Pharaoh was having a dream that was troubling him. The dream was that there would be 7 good years of harvest, then 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh heard this, listened, and gave him second position in Egypt, and a weird name along with it. The Egyptians harvest as much grain, so when the famine struck, people from all over came to Egypt for grain. And in those people were 11 guys, the brothers to Joseph. Joseph questioned them and wanted them to prove their worth by bringing their youngest son, Benjamin. They did so, and after a long situation, Joseph forgave them. Joseph brought all the people of Canaan into Egypt along with his father, who blessed all of his sons, but he blessed Judah the most. He also chose Joseph's younger son Ephraim to be blessed, and he chose the younger one on purpose. Jacob died in Egypt, and later Joseph also died in Egypt as well. The line now continued through the 12 tribes, or the sons. But that had to be paused for a brief interruption during the time of Sinai and Exodus. After many years in Egypt, the Hebrews were growing rapidly, and the Pharaoh saw this as a possible threat. He decided to put them all to work and kill all the males under 2 years old who were Hebrew. However, God chose one baby to stay alive, and that baby was nameless. He was floated down a river by his mother and drawn out of the water by the daughter of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh's daughter wanted to keep the boy, even though she knew that he was Hebrew. The nameless baby now had a name, Moses. Moses grew up in the Egyptian household as an adopted son to Pharaoh. One day when he was out watching what was going on outside, he saw an Egyptian slave master abusing a Hebrew. So Moses accidentally killed him. Moses didn't want to get caught, so he fled to the land of Midian, where he hid for a few years. There he came across a group of people, the Midianites, and he married the high priest's daughter, Zipporah. Okay, here comes another one day. One day when Moses was out tending his sheep, he saw a light from a cave and went to it. And there he saw a bush on fire. But the bush would not burn up. Then it suddenly talked to Moses. It indeed was God himself talking. He said to go back to the land of Egypt and talk to Pharaoh. As the brave man we all know Moses to be, he would gladly do it. We all wish. But Moses had a powerful answer. No. So God sent Aaron with him to talk for Moses, his brother. The Pharaoh was asked if he could let the Hebrew people go. Pharaoh said no. So God challenged him and sent a bunch of nasty things onto the Egyptians. After only 10 terrible disasters and plagues, including the death of the Pharaoh's one and only son, he finally let the Hebrews go. The Hebrews left Egypt, partied all the way out. They seemed unstoppable, but not to the Red Sea. They were stuck at the Red Sea with nowhere to go. Oh, and by the way, the Pharaoh changed his mind, so he went back for them. God commanded Moses to take his staff and split the Red Sea in half. And it worked. The Hebrews rushed through the sea with the Egyptians following behind. When all the Hebrews made it across, God closed the sea and many Egyptians drowned. You'd think they'd be smarter than that. Now God's chosen people are safe now. Life goes on perfect. Wrong. When they made it to the other side, Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai to retrieve the 10 Commandments from God. There, God made the Mosaic covenant with Moses. They are not to worship any other gods, agree to God's laws, and if they do this, God will bless them. Fair trade. Meanwhile, down below, the Hebrews legit forgot what God just did for them, like 10 seconds ago. So they built a golden calf with an idiot leading them. That's right, that man who helped Moses speak, Aaron. When Moses came down, he was so mad he smashed the 10 Commandments. It's kind of like now, God, why don't you just start this all over with Moses? But no, God would use these people. They are his blessed nation after all. God was slow to anger and was gracious, and he was constant in loving them. He spared the faithful ones and eliminated those who were not. The Hebrews also created something called the Tabernacle, which was where God could dwell among his people. It was a momentary thing, one that they can move from place to place. Now all was well. The Hebrews just wandered around the desert for a few years, just 40 years with lots of incidents along the way. In the end, they finally came to the promised land, but Moses could not enter since he sinned greatly against God. So Joshua led them into the land and became their new leader. However, the Israelites, same thing as Hebrew, no worries, they just changed their name, screw up again and worship other idols. To punish them, God had a foreign nation take them captive. This is part of the Old Testament where the cycle begins. They sin, get captured, repent, get delivered by a judge chosen by God, and have some time of peace in the end. This cycle goes on for a long time, not worth mentioning. During this time, the story of Ruth occurs. Basically, the story of Ruth is a story where the sons of a widow named Naomi married two women. One was Ruth. When the sons die, Naomi and Ruth stick together, and Ruth married a man named Boaz. It was through them the Messiah would come. Later down the road, the story of Sam began. The story of Samuel begins with a barren woman named Hannah, who God grants a son, and she praises him for it. She dedicates him to God, and he grows up being a great judge and a great prophet as well. After Sam becomes an adult, the Israelites beg for a king so they can be like all the other nations, not knowing that they have God as their leader. I mean, how much better can you get than that? Sam consults God about this and asks him if he's okay with the Israelites having a king. God is very upset over this, but he's okay with the Israelites having a king, but he gives them warnings as well. Samuel anoints Saul, and Saul is Israel's first king. King Saul is anointed by the first prophet and the last judge of Israel, Samuel. Saul is chosen to be king because he is good looking, and other than that, he was terrible. He disobeys God and Samuel, like that time he had made a sacrifice without Samuel before a war which he was told not to, and he couldn't wait an extra 5 minutes for Samuel to show up. He's also from the line of Benjamin, just letting you know. Samuel sees that Saul is bad, and so does God, so the look for a new king begins. So, Samuel goes to the household of Jesse, who has many sons. He asks him to show him all of his sons. Jesse calls out all of his sons and shows each beginning with the best to worst. Samuel looks at them and says, "Yeah, none of them work." Then Samuel asked if there was any more. Jesse said yes, but the boy was young and he was just a shepherd. Jesse called for him, and his name was David. Samuel took one look at him and said, "That's the one." David was anointed king at a young age, but Saul would still reign for some time. Meanwhile, over by Saul's life, a nation called the Philistines came to Israel and basically said, "Let's have a 1v1. We give our best, you give yours. Loser serves winner." The Philistines gave their best man, Goliath, who was a ripped giant, and Israel had no one who would stand up. David heard this and went out and asked if he could fight. He talked to Saul. It took some convincing, but eventually he said yes. So David went out to a river, got some stones, and went up to Goliath. Goliath laughed. David prepared to fire his slingshot, and the stone hit Goliath square in the forehead. Then David chopped his head off, and Israel won. That last part is actually true, though. For real, he chopped his head off. After this happened, Israel loved David more than Saul. They would sing, "Saul has killed thousands, and David has killed tens of thousands." Saul got jealous and tried to kill David twice. So the son of Saul, Jonathan, helped David flee from him. When Saul finally died, David returned as Israel's king. David now was from the chosen line of Judah, and God made a covenant with him as well, the Davidic covenant. God promised an everlasting throne and kingdom, a son of God relationship. His son would build the temple, and the covenant cannot be broken. David mostly is a great king. He establishes Jerusalem as the capital of the city, does other good stuff, but there are bad things too. David spied on a woman named Bathsheba when she was bathing. David went to her and asked her to return with him to his place. That night, Bathsheba became pregnant, but was already married. Her husband was one of David's best friends, Uriah. To cover this up, David sent an order out that when the soldiers prepared to fight, to completely step back and have Uriah stand in front and die. When Uriah dies, Nathan, David's prophet, predicts the future for him. David's punishment was that he would suffer family issues. Eventually, all of his children will kill each other. But God, once this happened, granted another son through Bathsheba, Solomon. Solomon was destined to be great. Then idols came. But we're not there quite yet. When Solomon is king, he builds the temple in Jerusalem where God's glory fills the temple. One night, God came to Solomon telling him he would give anything to him that he wanted, riches, fame, anything. Solomon asked for wisdom. Because he asked for wisdom, God also gave him riches and fame. You would think that he would be smart now that he was, and still is, the wisest man who ever lived. He has many wives and introduces many idols in Israel, and here is where the kingdom is torn from his son Rehoboam. Now there are two kingdoms, the north and the south. After Solomon dies, the kingdom divides, the northern and the southern kingdoms. The capital of the northern was Samaria, and the one for the southern was Jerusalem. All the kings up north were all evil, and in the south it wasn't much better. So let's not spend much time talking about kings. Prophets are more of an interesting story to talk about now. Prophets usually did weird things to draw attention, and even though they were weird, they were accurate depictions of what the future was. They were basically like covenant watchdogs. They would point out the sins that Israel was doing and try to get them back on the right track. During the divided monarchy, there were many prophets, such as Elijah, Elisha, Micah, Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Jonah, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. Each prophet has his own thing to say to Israel, and they all did it in a weird and peculiar way, some of them. In the year 722 BC, the northern kingdom falls to Assyria, and years later, the southern is conquered by Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah warned King Zedekiah, the last king of Israel, that he must forgive God and repent before the Babylonians come. But Zedekiah refused, and as a result, his consequences were punished. This is the point in the Old Testament where life for the Israelites gets really ugly. Their sins are finally being punished, and in the most terrible way so far. God has lifted his right hand off of his people and left the temple. Seriously, Ezekiel saw the presence of God leave the temple. God has a nation take the Israelites over, and that nation is Babylon. However, God made a promise that there will be a return and restoration. Before we go any further, there are a few things that need to be covered real quick. King Zedekiah, the last king who ruled over Israel, was bad. He betrayed the nation of Babylon by making alliances with nations he wasn't supposed to. So Babylon decided to destroy them. Now, resuming where we left off, the Babylonians are outside of the capital of the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, and are beginning to attack. King Zedekiah takes his two young boys and attempts to flee, but the Babylonians catch him and do the worst things anything could happen to him. They gouge out his eyes, and before that, they, do something even worse, kill his sons. Now the line has no one to continue off to, and the last known prophet, Jeremiah, is taken to Egypt, and the chosen lineage is once again put on hold for this event. However, there was hope through a man named Daniel and his 3 friends. King Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and his friends to work for him in his palace, where Daniel also interprets a dream for the king. The dream went like this. There was a statue made of many metals, the head gold, chest and arms of silver, the belly bronze, legs iron, and feet a mix of clay and iron. Suddenly, a rock, not carved by human hands, came crashing down and destroyed the statue. Then the rock turned into a huge mountain. Then Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar what it meant. The gold head symbolized the nation of Babylon, and that it would be the greatest of them all. Then the silver would be the second, and so on and so on. The rock represents another nation, not from this world, that will destroy all earthly kingdoms and will create an everlasting kingdom. That kingdom, of course, is the kingdom that Jesus, the Messiah, will rule over. King Nebuchadnezzar greatly favored Daniel from that point forward and put him second in command of his wise men. Later on, the king created a great statue and ordered everyone to bow down, and those who didn't would be cast into the fiery furnace. So everyone did so because they obviously didn't want to die, all but 3 men. Those 3 men were the 3 friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the king's guards went to them, tied a rope around them, and threw them into the furnace. However, they did not burn, and everyone did indeed see a 4th man walking in the furnace with them. It didn't seem possible since the soldiers who threw them in were burned alive from the heat. The 3 men came out, and Nebuchadnezzar could not believe his eyes. Years down the road, Nebuchadnezzar goes mad and is locked away in the first loony bin, and his son Belshazzar takes over. Belshazzar was very wicked. He took the sacred relics from the temple and used them for his own use. One time specifically at a party, he used the relics for him and his guests. Then suddenly, a hand appeared and began to write on the wall. It wrote the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. None of the wise men could explain what any of it meant. However, there was one, Daniel, and he was immediately brought into the scene. The king promised purple clothing and a gold chain necklace, but Daniel refused and would tell him anyway. The words meant that his days had been numbered, that he had sinned greatly, and that a new nation will take over. That night, King Belshazzar was killed by King Cyrus of Persia. Now, the Babylonians were no more, and Persia now ruled over them. Not much is mentioned about what happens in Persia and Daniel, just that the king really favored Daniel above all his wise men. The other wise men grew jealous of Daniel and wanted to expose him somehow, but Daniel always remained faithful to the Lord. There was no way the other wise men could eliminate Daniel. After much thinking, they came up with this idea. They immediately went to the king and had him sign a decree. The decree was that no one was to pray to God for 3 months, and whoever did would be thrown into the lion's den. When Daniel heard this decree, he ignored it and just prayed to God in front of the window. Eventually, the other wise men saw this and reported to the king. The king was so distraught over this, he couldn't go back on his word. He signed the decree. He did not want to send Daniel to death, but he had to. Daniel was thrown into the den, and that night, the king was sleepless. When dawn broke, Cyrus rushed to the den and found that Daniel was indeed alive. Cyrus was amazed by this and ordered for all his wise men to be thrown into the den. Later, Cyrus made a decree to have all those who believe in God set free, and anyone who wanted to return to Jerusalem were allowed to. At this point, the time of the exile had ended, and the Israelites would begin their return to their land. The temple unit is prophesied by Isaiah before the event itself happened. Isaiah predicted that the bird of prey will come, meaning Persia, and that they will come through the east, and that they will free them. Also, Jeremiah predicted when it would happen. The exile would last 70 years until they would return to the land. There were 2 waves of Jews who returned. The first wave of Jews, yes, now called Jews, returned to the land just as God promised. However, when they returned, they just went back to their old sinful routine. Intermarriage occurs again. They offer diseased animals, and there is no tithing. There is also economic exploitation of others. More on the historical side now. The first wave returned under Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, who was the high priest. During this time, the prophet Haggai preaches to them. The first wave that returned didn't focus on the temple too much, but their houses instead. Then construction comes to a halt for a while. There is a 60-year gap between the first and second wave. When the second wave comes along, they construct the temple more, led by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was a covenant-faithful man, while Nehemiah built the walls. As the temple is being built, a man named Zedekiah has visions. A royal branch will build God's temple, and God will dwell among his people. The king is coming with salvation, and he will be mounted on a donkey, and Jerusalem will be a blessing to all nations. He says the new Jerusalem would be like a new Garden of Eden. He also challenged the remnant to be faithful and to be better than their ancestors. Finally, when the temple was rebuilt in 516 BC, there was no evidence that God returned. The people celebrated, as in the young generation, but the older generation wept because the temple wasn't as glorious as their original one. Before we go forward, there's an event that occurs between two waves of people who return, and that is the story of Esther. The story begins with a woman named Vashti, the wife to the king at the time, whose name was Xerxes. The king wanted to show his guests how beautiful his wife was, so he ordered her to come down to the banquet he was hosting. She refused to go to the banquet, so the king got rid of her and wanted to find a new queen. The king wanted a group of women to be brought to him, and they would all have to go through the long process of preparing to be selected. Xerxes chose a woman named Esther. Esther was being raised by her cousin Mordecai since her parents died, so he was like her father figure. One day, Xerxes honored one of his men, Haman. Then, the king ordered everyone to bow down to Haman. However, there was one Jew who decided not to bow down, and that man was Mordecai. Since Haman was upset that Mordecai would not bow down to him, he went to the king and asked him if he could eliminate all those who would not obey the law, and the king said yes. When Mordecai heard this, he became very distressed. Esther found out and wanted to know why. Mordecai told her, so Esther decided that she would go to the king even though if it would mean she would have to die. 3 days later, Esther went to the king and asked if he could and Haman could go to a banquet that she was hosting. The king said yes, and he went there. At the banquet, the king asked what she wanted, and she said that she would tell him if they go to the banquet tomorrow that she is hosting. After the banquet ended, Haman went to his family and talked about the banquet and about Mordecai. He decided that he wanted to impale him on a pole. Later, Haman was summoned to go to the banquet, so he did, along with the king. There, Esther asked if the king could spare the lives of the Jews, and that he would prevent the person who wants to kill them, from killing them. The king asked who it was, and she said that it was Haman. The king was furious and had him killed. Then Xerxes honored Mordecai since he gave input about a plot to kill him that he forgot about. And in the end, Esther saved him and the Jews. Now, resuming where we left off. The last story of the Old Testament, the last prophecy in the Old Testament, and the last book. The last prophet, Malachi, writes that the coming of the Lord has been delayed due to the sins of the people, but God will return to his temple after someone comes to prepare his way. Then he will come. Then the Old Testament comes to an end. So, the story of the Old Testament ends with the temple rebuilt, but no presence of God within. It leaves the people waiting for God to return, and they end up waiting for 400 years till something happens again. In the Bible, there are many characteristics of God that are displayed throughout each time period, or unit, two of which are constant and creative. In the creation and Abraham unit, he constantly tells his people to be fruitful and multiply the earth. In Sinai, God constantly shows his love to his people, even though they screw things up constantly over and over again. Throughout the whole Bible, God is constant in that way. In the King's unit, God always provides hope for them, both in the exile unit too. In Temple, God is constant in bringing them back into the land they were promised. A second characteristic of God is that he is the most creative person ever. In creation, he created the universe. That pretty much sums up that unit. Throughout the rest of the story of the Old Testament, there are so many events and causes tied with each other. There are so many connections, and some of them are really mind-blowing, and that is all the work of God. One way God challenged me personally in this project was to basically do the project as in to explain the story of the Old Testament in a fun way. This was the first time I had ever had to explain the entire storyline from beginning to end of the Old Testament in a time that is short enough for a listener to handle. This project was by far the longest and the hardest one I had ever had to do so far. This next part of the video isn't necessarily part of the storyline or the project. I put it in the video to show how much work I had to put into this project. So this is what I am seeing in creating this project. Sorry for the bad quality of the sound and the visuals. This is off my phone right now. I don't have a screen recorder. So for the project, I had to import all of these square boxes that you see. All of this artwork up here, I had to create in this application up here called Adobe Illustrator. Forgot the name for a second. So in this, I created all of the character models and backgrounds that I needed for this video. For each character, it would take about 2 to 7 minutes depending on how big the character is or how many people it is. Like this, that's a group. Or if it's a message, like the written message on the wall, or if it's like multiple pieces that I had to create. So depending how long it was or how big the model was, it would take more time. For the backgrounds up here, I had a total of, let's see, 41 backgrounds that I created, plus 41 plus backgrounds that I had to create. So each of these backgrounds I had to create, and they take longer, so they would take, well, except for that one, but some of them are long, like the temple, that would take more time to create. They would take from about maybe 4 to 10 minutes to create some of them. And then once I create it, for example, this is me at the end of the video, this is my character model. What I would have to do is I would have to go up to here, click File, and then export them. When I export them, that allows me to drop them into Final Cut Pro, which is the animation application that I'm using. So I have to drop them in here, and this is where they come from. That's where they come from. And then once I do that, I have to take them and drag them down here. And each individual box that you see, I had to position at the right time for the right length. And I had to time it correctly with this audio. So the first thing I had to do overall in this project was create a script, and then I had to record myself reading the script. And that's all of this. Once I did that, I had to break up the pieces, as you see, in sections. So that took a lot of time. So overall, each unit, like of the casket, creation, Abraham, etc., would take about 6 hours. So if you do the math, that's about 36 hours. And if you add the other time creating the script and the character models, that would add a little more time. So each of these boxes I had to individually position. This is the part that took a long time. All of these boxes. All of these, all of this. Just keeps going, all for the 30 minutes. Now, there's still more stuff. So, for some people, as in some, I mean all of them basically, all of the character models, as you see up here, this screen, they all have different faces from time to time. So God, he has a straight face at that point, and now he's angry at Cain. In this scene, he's angry at Cain. Now, in this application, I can't just drop in any face or emotion that I want. What I have to do is I have to go here, copy the character, and replace the face. So if I don't want this face, if I want my character model with another face, like let's say a happy face right here, I have to replace it. It doesn't seem like a lot of work, but once you gotta do over 75 characters, do that to 75 characters each, it gets tiresome. So that is what I had to do. So just one last look. Because when you watch the video, you may not understand the full idea and how much work is going into this. So I'm just showing this right now. There you go. Do not alter my grade watching this video. Do not alter my grade watching this last part. It's just to give you a little perspective. So grade off of the project part before the part that I said. That's not part of the project. This is just to give you perspective. Do not alter my grade because of this. don't make any better. Don't make it any better now. That it looks a lot will work. Just grade it off of the project. This is for perspective only.